A student who's here right now, I just wanted to say congratulations on your acceptance. And we're excited to have you today for our sociology mock class. We've got a few professors here to chat with you today, which we're super excited about. We do have the chat feature in the Zoom, so you're welcome to ask any questions you have in there. Absolutely feel free to turn your camera on if you want to, but don't feel like you have to. Whatever you're comfortable with. We love to see some faces on the Zoom, but you definitely don't have to. And then towards the end, we definitely will have some time for Q&A if you have any questions. And then I can pop back on the end just to kind of wrap up. But I can turn it over to our three wonderful professors that we have here today. And if you guys want to get started.
All right, great. Thank you, Caitlin. Hi, MJ, is that what you prefer to go by your name?
Yes.
All right, hi, MJ. So I'm Professor Kaufman-Parks. I am the chair of the Sociology and Criminology department. I do teach mostly criminology classes, but I am trained as a sociologist. And then with me today, I also have Professor Kyle Woolley and then Professor Frank Pryor, who are both assistant professors of sociology. So before we get started, can you just tell me a little bit about yourself, where you're zooming in from? You look to be in a very sunny, nice weather place right now.
Yeah, I'm from Puerto Rico, San Juan, Puerto Rico.
Very nice, very nice. All right, so today we're going to talk about an issue that I think is really relevant to both sociology and criminology. So if you decide to come to Assumption and major in sociology, you would probably be exposed to a lot of issues around social inequality. So we're going to talk a bit about social inequality today and just kind of have a laid back conversation with you, a little bit of teaching, but really sort of hearing your input and your interests on things. And then after we do that, we'll sort of reserve at least a good 20 minutes or so for you to ask any questions about being a sociology major at Assumption, anything about the department in particular, or sort of Assumption in general. So just to sort of get started, if I said the term social inequality, what do you think when you hear that? Like, how would you personally define social inequality?
Social inequality?
Mm-hmm.
The differences between people, from where they came from, like what they like, what they don't like, differences in people.
Oh, and we have another student joining. Okay, so sort of differences in people, right? So some sort of inequality. Do we want to pause, Caitlin, to allow them in and sort of reintroduce?
Yeah, sure. I think Sydney should be in here now. So welcome, Sydney. We just got started, so you haven't missed much. You're welcome to turn your camera on if you want to, but if not, totally feel free to do that too.
All right. Hi, Sydney. How are you?
I am good, thank you.
All right, where are we zooming in from today?
I'm in Myrtle Beach, actually.
We got both people who are like in very nice weather places, and here we are in like 25 degrees and expecting 4 to 8 inches of snow tomorrow. I'm a little jealous. Well, thank you for joining us. We were actually just talking to MJ, as Caitlin said, just sort of getting started. And what we're going to do today is really have a discussion focused on social inequality. So a little bit of teaching, but kind of really discussion oriented too, since we're a small group of people today. And so we'll do that for like the first half hour or so, and then reserve the rest of today's session for you to ask any questions of myself or Professor Woolley or Professor Pryor, who are all in the sociology and criminology department. So sort of to get the conversation started, if I were to ask you to sort of define social inequality, what do you think that might mean? The term social inequality.
I think that it's something in society that is making people struggle in some way that other people aren't.
Okay, great. So some sort of struggle.
Like not.
All right, so people are struggling in some way compared to other people who might not be. So in sociology, what we tend to sort of define, there's definitely a bunch of different definitions out there, is that there's some sort of unequal opportunity or some unequal reward for people who occupy different social positions or statuses or groups within a society. And so by unequal opportunities, we often mean such things like not having equal access to education or employment opportunities or healthcare. And then differing rewards might mean that people are either rewarded or punished differently, even if they engage in sort of the same exact behaviors as do other people who are in some way different from themselves. So what are your thoughts on sort of what sort of groups have this different inequality? So we're talking about differences between people. What sort of groups of people might have different opportunities and different rewards?
People with different skin colors most of the time, sexualities and some gender issues, I believe. And I think that's all I can think of.
Okay, so you had race and ethnicity, gender, and what was the other one you said? You sort of broke up a little?
Religion.
Religion, okay, religion's a big one. Can we think of any other ones? I think, Cindy, you might have said a third one. You said race and ethnicity, gender, and you might have said something else, but then you broke up.
Religion.
Religion, okay.
And
Sexuality.
Okay, so sexual orientation would be a big one. So let's dig into some of these a little bit. How does race and ethnicity potentially lead to differing opportunities or different rewards when we're talking about social inequality? Any ideas?
I'm not sure.
Not sure? That's okay. That's all right. It's definitely something you would learn if you would be a sociology major at Assumption. Professor Woolley and Professor Pryor, do you want to give some of your thoughts based on some of the classes that you teach, how race or ethnicity might structure social inequality? Or I can.
Well, you know, I think that one thing that I think about, you know, is a very, very simple thing. You know, simply where do people live? You know, and looking at those patterns, differences in where people live, and you know, how does that match up with, you know, their racial background? And then you say, okay, maybe we see some patterns, but why are those patterns the way they are? And that's one of the things we try to do in sociology, try to explain why things are the way they are. Professor Woolley?
To kind of go off on that, and then I might ask another question about, okay, let's look at where people live and let's compare resources in those particular communities. And then I might say, what does a school look like in one community versus what a school might look like in another community? How are they funded? What kind of opportunities do students have for classes? And then I might look at which students are where if I wanted to compare by race and ethnicity, or maybe by like socioeconomic status. So I might start thinking like that. I might start asking other questions to look for some of those patterns.
I'll kind of bring in both of what they said. So both Professor Woolley and Professor Pryor, they do a lot of really interesting research with like observations and interviewing people. They do like all of the word stuff. They're what we call qualitative researchers. I'm a math nerd, so I do all quantitative research and data. So of course, like I have some statistics that sort of tie these things in together. So a big place with social inequality by race and ethnicity, as Professor Woolley was getting at, is in our country, in the United States in particular, race and ethnicity is highly tied in with social class. So white people on average tend to be of higher social class than our people of color, in particular Black and Hispanic people, because of a whole history and continuing to today with things like institutional racism and structural racism. So just to kind of give you an idea, I teach a lot of classes like on juvenile delinquency and the family. So in our country, only about teenagers and white children are poor, which 14% still, a sizable proportion and something we should care about, but it's pretty small if we look at those numbers for other races and ethnicities. That number is 33% for Latina and Latino children and teenagers, and 39% for Black children. So Black children there's 3 times more Black children in poverty than there are white children. That can be really problematic when it comes to things like the resources in that community that both Professor Pryor and Professor Woolley were getting at. So a big thing, especially for kids and teenagers, and something that's really relevant to your lives right now as high school students, is the type of school you go to based on where you live. And if you're a person of color, you're more often than a white person living in a poor community, which means you're not going to the best of schools. Do you know how your school gets money to like pay for everything? Like how they pay for teachers and books and all of that stuff? Like where does that? Exactly, your taxes. And specifically for the vast majority of that comes from property taxes, which is what homeowners pay. So if you own a home, or more people in your community own a home, that means more property taxes for the school. So you get a better school. But if most parents in the community rent, they're not paying property taxes. And so that's a really big source of unequal opportunity, simply because you're poor and oftentimes in a community of color. What are your thoughts, MJ? What do you think about how people who are people of color compared to white people might be disadvantaged in society?
Can you ask the question again?
Yeah, not a problem. How do you think that people of color might potentially experience society differently than do white people in the United States? Any ideas other than access to resources in the community?
Yeah, because people still are racist and think of them as strangers and not think of them as people.
Exactly. So beyond just like these objective things that we can see, we can point to a school and say that school is obviously not as funded as well as another school. We can point to a community and we can physically see with our eyes what's going on. But then there's these more personal, subjective things, these ideas that as a person of color, you may experience discrimination or prejudice. So it's not something that people can, in all instances, easily observe, but that can have really bad psychological effects on people, mental health effects. What I teach a lot of stuff in the criminal justice system, and we know that people of color are treated differently than our white people. That's a huge factor with social inequality, that people of color are suspected more of committing crimes, that when they do get arrested, they oftentimes face a harsher punishment than do white people, even if they're committing the same exact crimes. So that's a huge, huge issue. What else? So we talked about, MJ, you talked about religion. How is there sort of social inequality based on religion?
Because people think they don't have their same opinions, so they discriminate others people's religion, and they don't like, if you believe in God and someone doesn't, then they will judge you.
Okay, very good, very good. Can you think of anything else to add to that, Sydney, or you kind of sort of agree?
I agree with her.
Yeah. Now, Professor Woolley, you do some stuff on religion, so how would you look at differences in equality based on religion? What might be some things, how we might see that in society?
I might look at, for example, how people who participate in different faith communities or have different faith traditions, how they might be stereotyped, or how, say, certain religious groups are political targets, maybe sometimes if somebody belongs to a particular religion where there are larger stereotypes in society, how they might be treated differently. And so I might think about that. Another thing I might also think about is how people who practice a particular religion how that creates a kind of a unity of that group that allows them to sort of advocate for needs that the community might have, or how religion also motivates people to sort of give back to their community. So I might think about it in two different ways.
Anything to add to that, Professor Pryor? No?
Sure, just a little bit. When I think of religion, I think in our contemporary social context, one of the things I think very much along the lines of what Professor Woolley is saying is how religion is connected to other spheres of life. And I think the one that I see it quite often connected to is the political sphere. And so examining those connections is something that we can do as sociologists.
That's a really good point. Not only the political sphere, so how your religion might influence your political beliefs, but also things like your family beliefs, like what does and does not constitute a family is, for many religions, very specifically defined. So, Sydney, you also talked about sexual orientation. That may or may not be necessarily something that is widely accepted, depending on the religion that you belong to. So a lot of these things sort of really interconnect when it comes to not only structuring social inequality, but as Professor Woolley said, also these groups can sort of give you support networks. They can help you form collective action and do social movements. One of the things that I was thinking about that I think some people often take for granted, but has sort of made it to the forefront in recent years, and as a sort of a broader public discussion, is the things like, just simple things like the holidays that we honor in the United States. Because we're largely a Christian society, we recognize things like Easter and Christmas, and everybody sort of celebrates those. But if you're not of a Christian faith tradition, your holidays sort of get ignored. So what does that mean if you don't necessarily get to take your holiday off with an employer? Or the fact that, simple things, just going to the store and everyone automatically assumes Merry Christmas. That's not always the case for some people. So just sort of little daily things like that we maybe don't necessarily realize that could impact people's lives on a smaller scale, but still certainly has an impact to some extent. All right, what about the other ones that we talked about? What about gender or biological sex? Who are the people who are unequal there, the men or the women? Who has the advantage?
I think that men still have kind of an advantage just because they did so much, and it's hard to bring that back and make it exactly equal.
Good. What are your thoughts on that, MJ?
I agree with her.
Yeah? All right, so what might be some examples that we talk about in our department when it comes to gender and social inequality? I think a big one is social class. So even to this day, while we are making progress in society, women only make 82 cents for every $1 that a man makes. So that's pretty problematic, that the fact that we're making 18 cents less than our men for doing the same job. And right now, even though we are making progress, if we continue at our current rate of progress, women won't make the same amount of men until 2093. So we got another 72 years, which even though you haven't yet started your career, means that you wouldn't see gender pay equality before you even retired. That's a really long time so it would be like your kids would see it when they're 40, and your grandkids might see it in their life at the current progress. And it's not just pay too, it's representation. So again, if we sort of connect these things, like both Professor Pryor and Woolley said, how they're connected, think of politics and our political representation. It is only in this year that for the very first time, we have a woman who is a vice president. Until this day, we still haven't had a female president. If you look at Congress, only about a quarter, about 26% of the members of the House of Representatives and the Senate are women. Today, only 9 state governors are women. So women are grossly underrepresented in politics. And we see that same thing in sort of the private sector too. Right now, less than 5% of CEOs in Fortune 500 companies are women. Less than 5%, even though we're half of the population. So it's really hard to get equality from a gender standpoint if you're kind of shut out of all of the places you could get it, because our power is in doing things like structuring organizations and voting for the things we care about and making the rules. But if you're shut out of all of those places, then how are you able to do that? And so that's sort of some of the things that we talk about in our department. Professor Woolley is actually teaching a class right now on social movements. So it's this idea, if you are a person who's in one of these underrepresented or disadvantaged groups, if you see something in society that you simply don't like or is affecting you personally, how do you organize with other people and like make changes toward that? So along those same lines, Professor Woolley, do you want to share, do you have any sort of gender movements that you talk about in your class?
Yeah, so in my class later on in the semester, we'll be talking a little bit about I do a lot of research of like community organizing, and I do a lot of my research in Latin America. And so we're going to be looking at the role of women in Lima, Peru, and also in Brazil, and the role of women in different communities, the role that they've played in organizing their community to demand things like running water, to demand things like having a land title to their homes, to demand things like access to healthcare. So when I often do research on the role that women play in social movements, it's often looking at not only women's role as like a political organizer, but also the kinds of outcomes that they get through their work that generally are in support of their family and their community well-being. So I also think about sort of the multiplier effect of the role that women play as community organizers in benefiting everybody.
So just to sort of like, before we get onto the second part of this discussion, I did actually want to show a small video clip that I show in a lot of my classes, and Professor Pryor and Professor Woolley might show it as well. And I think it's a really good demonstration of how social inequality plays out, but in some ways that we might not necessarily think about. And what it actually is, it's high school students who are taking part in a race. And if they win, they get $100. But as we'll see, depending on their life circumstances, depending on if they have unequal access to things, their starting line looks a lot different. So I'm going to take just a few minutes. It's only about 4 minutes long, but I think this is a really good sort of example of what sort of things we discuss in our classes. Now, let me know, you should be able to hear this.
Everybody line up. Shoulder, take off your backpacks. Basketball, line up. We're about to race. Hey, we are racing for a $100 bill. The winner of this race will take this. A $100 bill. Before I say go, I'm going to make a couple statements. If those statements apply to you, I want you to take 2 steps forward. If those statements don't apply to you, I want you to stay right where you're at. Take 2 steps forward if both of your parents are still married. Take 2 steps forward if you grew up with a father figure in the home. Take 2 steps forward if you had access to a private education. Take 2 steps forward if you had access to a free tutor growing up. Take 2 steps forward if you've never had to worry about your cell phone being shut off. Take 2 steps forward if you've never had to help mom or dad with the bills. Take 2 steps forward if it wasn't because of your athletic ability, you don't have to pay for college. take 2 steps forward if you never wondered where your next meal was going to come from. I want you guys up here in the front just to turn around and look. Every statement I've made has nothing to do with anything any of you have done. Has nothing to do with decisions you've made. Everything I have said has nothing to do with what you've done. We all know these people up here have a better opportunity to win this $100. Does that mean these people back here can't race? No. We would be foolish to not realize we've been given more opportunity. We don't want to recognize that we've been given a head start. But the reality is we have. Now, there's no excuse. They still got to run their race. You still got to run your race. But whoever wins this $100, I think it'd be extremely foolish of you not to utilize that and learn more about somebody else's story.
I'll end that there because I think that's the most powerful part of that. What are your thoughts or reactions to that?
That was really sad to watch, I feel like.
Yeah, it was. What do you think, MJ?
I agree with her because it's all the difference from all the people and their cultures and from where they came from.
Yeah, so it definitely highlights all of those differences, and it's sad, especially because what the coach or the teacher said at the end, those differences had nothing to do with what the people who got moved up, like how hard they worked in life. It was simply where they were born, the families they were born into, the amount of money they had. And that's not to say that the people at the front of the line don't work hard. It's not to invalue the fact that people who do well in life work hard. Of course they do, but it is to acknowledge that just because you're not as well off doesn't mean you didn't try. It's because oftentimes you have to try a lot harder depending on where you're from, where you're born, what you look like, all of these different things. And that's important for us to recognize. So now that we recognize it and maybe we feel a little sad or upset about it, the next part is, what do we do about it? Right? Because if we see something that we don't like and it really affects us, then we should want to try to change that in some way or form, or at least think about how society might be able to change that. So what are your thoughts? Seeing that and seeing the sadness, what do you think? Or maybe we should start with sort of Professor Pryor and Professor Woolley, like, how would we go about fixing that if it makes us sad? How would we talk about those things in our classes? Or I could talk about it first, whoever wants.
Yeah, I mean, I guess one of the things that I guess I would want to know in a class, Sydney, so you said it made you sad to see that, and I guess I would ask you why.
Because I would have probably been ahead of a lot of people in that situation.
I see. So you reflected on some of the things that you've experienced in your life, and then you imagined yourself in that scenario, and also saying, wow, there really is a lot of differences, right, in terms of the opportunities that people are afforded by factors that are totally outside of their control, right? And, do you feel any other ways about it, I guess is what I would wonder? Any other feelings?
I feel like, I don't know, it's like you want to help them, like you feel guilty for them because you know it's not their fault. That's really it. And it makes me sad.
Okay.
One of the things I heard at the very end was about getting to know people's stories. And one of the things that sociologists try to do is try to understand the world we live in by really listening to people's stories, like all the different events in their lives that brought them to where they are in that line, for example. And that might allow us, if we were to start to listen to people's stories, start to think a little bit about some of the different advantages and disadvantages that we experience, and then think about collectively, like, how might we level the playing field? In other words, how might we make access to tutors or educational opportunities much more accessible to everybody? But one of the ways I might start by doing that is really trying to get a sense of other people's stories, particularly stories of people that maybe don't have the same experience that I do, because I think that is like one way that we could tap into that. You know what I mean?
So, and beyond, once we get to the stories, again, I'm kind of the numbers nerd, so I love what Professor Pry and Professor Woolley do. It's so outside my wheelhouse, but that's why I think we're a great department. We each bring different things to the table. I do like a lot of numbers stuff and a lot of policy stuff. So while I love listening to hearing people's stories, I work with a lot of numbers. And so sometimes you can see stories through that number on what's really going on. Some of the ways that we talk about these things in our class, we posit different ideas, different policies, different programs that we might enact, whether that's on a local level or a national level, and sort of what the implications of those things would be. So right now, if you follow the news at all, one of the things that's being talked about is raising the minimum wage, a $15 an hour minimum wage. That's something we might talk about in our class, and what might be the advantages or the disadvantages of that. Like right now, the minimum wage, the federal minimum wage is $7.25 an hour. So even working full time, 40 hours a week, if you make minimum wage, that's only $15,000 a year. That is not anywhere near enough money to live on, especially in many parts of the country. In Massachusetts, it's estimated that a single person would need about $44,000 a year just to sort of cover basic necessities. That's not like you're wealthy or rich. That's meaning you have a roof over your head, you have a little bit of a savings, you're able to like pay back student loans, $44,000 a year. Yet working full time and getting federal minimum wage is $15,000. That's a 3 times difference. And so we might talk about, what does that mean? But then there's people who don't really like the $15 minimum wage idea, because they're like, well, if I'm a small business person, I can't afford to pay my employees that. And so what are the implications for small business people? So we might talk about things like that. We might also talk about things like access to healthcare. People spend a lot of money every year on healthcare. We're one of the very few countries that don't have a national healthcare plan. So government provided healthcare opposed to corporate private healthcare. What's the implications of that? And so we might talk about in our classes, like, what do we do in the United States versus what do other countries do, and sort of what are the advantages and the disadvantages? And so our role, I think, as sociologists is not only to explore sort of why these differences exist, but then think about all of the different policies or programs we could enact to help these differences. And always keep in mind the different groups of people we're talking about. Because right now we see with like COVID, for example, a very relevant thing, that different groups of people are being impacted very, very differently by it. And so every time you initiate some sort of policy, you want to make sure that there's equal access and equal opportunity for every group of people. And so I think those are some of the things that we would talk about in our classes as well. Any other sort of comments, questions, concerns related to social inequality in particular before we have like a general Q&A or thoughts? No? All right, so what kind of questions might you have about our department, about being a sociology major, about assumption in general, that you might be curious about that we could help you answer?
I don't think I have any questions. Thank you.
No? What about you, MJ?
Is the sociology and criminology, how do I mix that sociology as a major and criminology as a minor?
You could, or you could actually do a double major. So we actually have a double sociology and criminology major in our program. It's what we call an accelerated double major, because a lot of times if you tried to major in two things, you would have to be at Assumption longer than 4 years, and most students don't want to do that. So we have accelerated it so where a lot of the classes double count. So you can actually double major and do both majors in 18 classes, plus all of your general education requirements, and still graduate within 4 years. I would say right now we're at 99 majors in our department. We need just one more for lucky 100. And I would say out of those 99, probably 70 of them are double majors. So it's actually much more common to see double than it is pure social or pure crim. But you could definitely, if you wanted to do a minor, we also have a fair number of people who mix either criminology and sociology with like psychology. That's a really popular combination as well. Or even our human services program, we get some people who minor in that. But you could very easily double major in both of them. Let me ask you this, why are you both interested in sociology?
I want to work in human services or major in that.
All right, so sociology would be a really good pairing for that. So we could, if you're interested, we could work with you to figure out how you could double major in them, or you could major in one and minor in the other. But I think understanding human behavior and how different groups are affected is definitely applicable if you're working in any sort of human services field. We have quite a few people who, I don't know many that were in, I'm trying to think in human services in particular, but we have quite a few people working like victim services. And then we have a few former majors who are also more in like a family service capacity. So like Department in Children and Families, or work in the educational system. So sociology, I think, provides a really good background for that. What about you, MJ?
I like sociology because I want to know why people do what they do.
Okay. It's an excellent reason to do that. It was my first attraction as well. I actually, when I was an undergrad, I was like, why do people do things? And my initial reaction was to go the psychology route because I didn't know what sociology was. I never was exposed to that in high school. And I took a psychology class and I was like, hey, this, great class, great professor, but totally not for me. That was the one and only psychology class I took. And then I took sociology and I was like, this is, wow, like you can do something with this. This is really interesting. I love this. So yeah, it's a different way. It looks at why society and social structures and politics and all of these things go on influence how people behave rather than necessarily what's going on in your head, which I think is a really sort of, we're not looking necessarily at biology or, chemical imbalances, which do have their rightful place. We're looking more at how does society itself sort of structure human behavior, which I think is a pretty cool thing to look at. Anything else? Any questions about living in 20-degree weather with 4 feet of snow on the ground? I mean, since we got nice warm weather in both locations.
I'm on vacation. I ran away.
Oh, all right. Where are you originally from?
Oh, Worcester.
Oh, all right. So you're like right here. All right.
My mom works there. I don't know if any of you know her. Her name is Nikki Lazarus. She's in institutional advancement.
Okay. Yeah, I don't think we interact too much with them, but now I'm gonna keep an eye out for that.
Yeah.
What about you, MJ? What's the decision to come to a very cold part of the United States?
I like cold weather and I like a lot the university. I actually visited on January. I did a campus tour.
Very nice. Very nice. All right. All right. Any other? The floor is yours. Anything you have.
Thank you so much, all of you. I can do a little wrap up unless any of you wanted to, share any final words or anything else you wanted to add before we kind of wrap up.
I think we're good. I would just, my shameless self plug. I love our department. We're a small department, but we're very close knit. We get to know all of our students. So I think that's pretty amazing. I have been at Assumption for almost 7 years. Quite honestly, when I was in graduate school, I never planned on teaching. I thought it was like the most horrific thing in the world. And even when I applied at Assumption, like I came and visited and I went back home and I told my fiance, I'm like, that's where I want to work. He was like, a teaching school? Like, are you insane? And I never looked back. It was honestly the best decision of my life. So if both of you do decide to come to Assumption, I think you'll be very, very happy. I hope you do decide to major with us, but even if you don't, we're always around and happy to say hello to any of our students. Some of the ones I'm closest with aren't even our majors. So yeah, that's about all I have.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Professor Woolley or Pryor, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Can't follow that.
I know, such a good ending.
Well, I will also, MJ and Sydney, just in case you want it, I'm going to put my email address in the chat as well. So if you have any questions at all about the major or our department or anything, feel free to reach out at any time. I'm more than happy to answer your questions as best as I can, or at the very least direct you to someone who can answer them for me if I don't know the answer.
Awesome. Perfect. Thank you so much, all of you, for joining us today. And MJ and Sydney, I hope you both really enjoyed, today's mock class and you're enjoying our admitted student week that we're having this week. We do have lots more events, towards the second half of the week. So definitely, hopefully we'll see you at another event towards the end of this week.